Thank you, Vikas. Sorry for the delay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Navneet Kumar, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all to another edition of ICS Wednesday seminar titled "Between Positive and Negative Interdependence: India's Dynamic Amidst the U.S.-China Rivalry." Debates concerning power and influence arising from the nature of economic interdependence between nation states are gaining currency amidst the US-China rivalry, with middle power like India increasingly navigating these dynamics. Nation states are leveraging economic asymmetries, both positive and negative, as a tool to advance strategic, political, and security interests. Today's presentation will analyze India's economic dynamic, its advantages and vulnerabilities against the backdrop of US-China rivalry, particularly from a viewpoint of positive and negative interdependence arising from its economic exchanges with China. The speaker for today's seminar is Mr. Vivek Y. Kelkar. He is an independent researcher, analyst, and columnist focused on geoeconomics, geopolitics, and strategic risk. He is an adjunct faculty at the Indian Institute of Information Technology and Management and a visiting faculty at the Institute of Management, Indore. He holds an MA in International Political Economy from the University of Sheffield and MBA from Essex Business School. Mr. Kelkar writes a weekly column for Money Control and contributes to respected global and local platforms such as Asia Times, The Spectator, Modern Diplomacy, Founding Fuel, among other publications. His research interests include US-China rivalry across Asia Pacific and West Asia, with a particular focus on emergent issues and trends, insofar as they affect political economy and business strategy. The chair for today's seminar is Professor G. Venkatraman. He is a professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Indore, and an honorary fellow at the ICS New Delhi. His research interests include the current state of US-China power rivalries, with a primary focus on the technology war and climate change, and China's interface with global governance. His recent publication is co-edited volume on BRICS titled Locating BRICS in the Global Order: Perspectives from Global South. He has also co-authored case studies on Indian business in China. Before I hand it over to the chair, I would like to request all the participants to follow a housekeeping rule. All the participants shall be muted during the seminar. Question may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I shall now hand it over to the chair. Over to you, Professor Raman.
Yeah, very good afternoon to everyone. Thanks a lot to ICS for giving me this opportunity to chair this Wednesday seminar. Uh, uh, just before I, share brief comments on this topic, I'd just like to, lay out a very general plan. So what I propose is Mr. Vivek Kelkar is going to take 35, 40 minutes plus 5 here and there, that's fine. And the remaining 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes, we'll be having Q&A. That includes me summing up, for 2 to 3 minutes once he finishes his presentation. Uh, so without further ado, I just introduce today's topic to you. The India-US-China trilateral relationship is perceived as one of the most important strategic triangles in the international system today. In a world which is fraught with trade conflicts, tech wars, virulent nationalism, these are having significant impact on today's international trade and commerce, mainly in the form of disruption of supply chains. Now, these disruptions are likely to widen and deepen with the likelihood of an international system marked by two distinct spheres of influence, each dominated by US and China, respectively. How does India get impacted given this growing rivalries between China and the US? One, given that multilateralism is increasingly on the decline, uh, India's determination to pursue its policy of what it calls quote unquote multi-alignment without compromising on strategic neutrality will be severely tested. If one adds India's growing aspirations to exercise voice in the international system by influencing global governance outcomes by adding new layers, we see that we are confronting major challenges. Now, these challenges get all the more compounded when one, sees from a US perspective, India is counted as one of as perhaps the most significant ally in this whole China containment strategy. Interestingly, the Chinese also, perceive that the US-India relations are, short-term and indirect exchanges. They lack trust, and in the long run, it is the relations between two civilizational states which are going to, which are going to hold more promise. So therefore, China characterizes Indo-US relations as in Chinese "tuan qi yili qiao yi." So how does India, which is straddled between these two powers, how does it pursue its policy of strategic neutrality? How does it pursue its policy of multi-alignment? These are some of the important questions that we need to ponder upon. Our speaker today looks at, India's position, India's choices, uh, and what are the uh, various policy options that India is to exercise, given that we are witnessing a world which is very quickly transforming from what Kevin and I, termed as complex interdependence to one which is characterized today as quote unquote weaponized interdependence, as Farrell and Newman have put it. So, with these few words, I would now request Mr. Vivek Kelkar to join in and share his presentation. Vivek, over to you.
Thank you, Venkat. Uh, Thank you, ICS and Dr. Acharya. It's an honor to be here. I'm just sharing my screen now. I'll just quickly go through how I've structured the presentation. We'll first ask ourselves whether economic interdependence, which is really the focus of this presentation, is being globalized, and we'll look at a couple of examples. We look at the US-China context because that sets the tone for the rivalry. We'll ask the core questions that need to be asked. And then we look at interdependence and security, particularly in the context of globally networked markets, globally networked value chains, which we cannot get away from. And then we look at the specific US-India and US-China context and the implications. So looking at how, just a couple of things on how economic interdependence is being weaponized. It's being noted both by China and the US and the EU. In January 11th, exactly a year ago, Chinese Ministry of Commerce spokesperson spoke about how they were highly concerned with United States direct intervention and interference in tech exports by direct Dutch companies. They argued that the US has instrumentalized and weaponized export control issues. About 4 months later, the EU almost echoed that statement, talking about how the geopolitical landscape was changing. It was getting more fragmented, conflicted, and how we saw the weaponization of trade. How do these two countries actually look at national strategy? RAND brought out a very interesting document last year where they talked about the elements involved in national strategy right across from diplomacy, economic investment, cybersecurity, trade, international cooperation, technical innovation, everything. China looks at it quite the same way. The hierarchy is very sharply defined by China. political security, economic security, military and cultural and social security. December last year, something very interesting happened. It was almost a tit-for-tat situation when the US put 140 Chinese companies under export controls. And this was done specifically in areas which were high-tech, semiconductor, advanced nodes, ICs, and they argued that these were dual military civilian uses for these products and these technologies, and the activities were determined to be contrary to US national security and foreign policy interests. Two things stood out: dual military civilian uses and national security and foreign policy. The US also tried to tighten the regulations that govern the connector economies, as they've been discussed extensively over the last year and a half, and indirect export of the sensitive items via third country manufacturers were also notified. A day later, China retaliated. It banned some very sensitive critical minerals, gallium, germanium, antimony. All had dual civilian military uses, and they were all critical for electronics, semiconductors, batteries. Antimony is particularly interesting because it's very critical for military use. It's used in manufacturing bullets and all sorts of other weaponry. It's not exactly new. We know how the US has used sanctions extensively over the decades. And we also have seen in 2016 how China responded to a South Korean decision to let the US deploy the THAAD missile system in a golf course, which was owned by a company called Lotta. And Lotta was forced to withdraw its retail brand from the Chinese market. South Korean products were banned. Media products were banned. And tourism was banned for a brief while, where the estimated impact of travel restrictions on South Korea was a whopping 15.6 billion. John Mearsheimer tends to be quite prescient in the way he looks at things. He identified way back in a talk in Australia in 2010 that the power gap between China and the United States in Asia Pacific was shrinking. And he also pointed out that both China and the US would be looking at each other's behavior, looking at their intentions, capabilities, and present behavior to analyze how they would deal with each other. He also pointed out that Washington was likely to go to considerable lengths to prevent China from becoming too powerful. And he expects that China will act the same way as the United States has in its long history. China will try to dominate the Asia Pacific as much as the US has dominated the Western Hemisphere. So the core question that he posed back then was, what is the best way to maximize a country's security in a world where another state might have offensive military capability as well as offensive intentions? And he also pointed out that states that achieve regional hegemony seek to prevent great powers from duplicating their feat in their region. A regional hegemon doesn't want peer competitors. So if we look at this in the context of economic interdependence, how does economic interdependence, when it's weaponized, impact the states on the choice of their political strategies? Do economic ties actually constrain the ability of choice? Blackwell and Harris had an interesting definition for geoeconomics: the use of economic instruments to promote and defend national interests to produce beneficial geopolitical results. IR theories on this over the decades have been somewhat ambiguous, but we have to note that they were written in a certain context. In the 70s, IR theories talked about interdependence leading to a win-win logic that prevailed over a zero-sum conflict. And they also spoke that it would spoke about raising the cost of utilizing military power and therefore reducing the incentives to do so. Again, when interdependence has been looked in IR, it's been looked at from the welfare aspects of trade theory rather than from an exit costs perspective. Back in 1945, Albert Hirschman posited that the interruption of trade is a risk and it drives bargaining power in international relations. Keown and Nye have also spoken about this in their book, Trade, Power and Interdependence, and they've talked about how asymmetries and interdependence provide sources of influence for actors. And they've also argued that economic interdependence provides opportunities for the state with less dependency to drive favorable political outcomes for change. Baldwin, back in 1980, drawing on Keown and Nye, called for a distinction between sensitivity interdependence and vulnerability interdependence. Now, this is particularly important when we look at this in the US, China, India context. Sensitivity interdependence implies contingency. It does not necessarily imply costs in breaking the relationship. Vulnerability interdependence, on the other hand, implies a cost to forego the relationship or exit costs. Let's look at what's happening in the global markets. We increasingly see global networked markets. China accounts already for about a third of global manufacturing, according to UNIDO, or potentially 45% by 2030. It's both a critical hub and a spoke in the global trading system, especially across frontier technology and industrial materials. China accounts for about 20% of global trade activity and 10% of global FDI. It's both a consumer market and a supplier. It's also a source of investment. Trade integration, which is happening rapidly across Asia. Asia and Asia Pacific is the largest growing segment markets in the world, is driven by supply chain shifts, as HSBC pointed out. Intra-regional trade is set to rise 65%, led by China, ASEAN, and India-ASEAN corridors. Supply chain trading drives a greater share of both regional trade and cross-border investments, both directly due to consumption within Asia itself and because the region is critical for global supply chains. But what has to be noted that it ties with mainland China, which are driving the integration. The integration is driven by a networked hub and spoke system centered around China across several industrial sectors. As Farrell and Newman point out, global economic networks are generating more and more asymmetries where exchange is centralized and flowing through a few specific intermediaries. And that's where China comes in. This is important as we look at power relations and the exercise of power. What's happening is that these networked markets are very difficult for domestic economies to unravel, and that they have remade domestic economies. They also create the potential for weaponized interdependence, which is a very interesting paper that they wrote way back in 2019, 5 years ago, in which some states are able to leverage interdependent relations to coerce others. States with political authority over central nodes in international network structures are uniquely positioned to impose costs on others. So what's happening is that firms and national economies provide domestic states with the necessary levers to extend their influence across borders. And when you look at national economies and you look at how market actors are pursuing efficiency and how market power is being used by different purposes for different purposes by states. Just look at the examples of Volkswagen in Germany and their dependency, the considerable dependency that they've created on China and the issues that are coming up in the EU in the automobile sector. The economist Evan Feigenbaum talks about the Indo-Pacific and the central strategic dynamic in this part of the world is the confrontational relationship between the US and China. He calls it the collision between economics and security. There's an important dynamic to India-US ties, as Venkat also pointed out in his statement, and as John Mearsheimer also points out. A large part of these ties have emerged over the last decade or 2 decades because both fear China. Now, John Mearsheimer made the statement back in 2014. And critical for India are to reckon with for India, China's economic strengths, regional adventurism, and territorial revanchism. What's the US-India context? India has manifold agreements with the US. There's all sorts of alphabet soups of agreements that have come up over the last few years. LEMOA, COMCASA, BECA, ISET. A lot of these are involved with the development of advanced military hardware, standard setting for emerging technologies, collaboration on next-gen chips and telecommunications. But let's note that all this was in the Biden administration context. One doesn't know, there's all sorts of statements coming, there's all sorts of pronouncements about the incoming Trump administration. Trump himself has made quite a few significant statements. But if we look at it, India's bilateral trade is $118 billion or thereabouts, second largest partner after China. It's also India is also a key destination for US businesses, especially IT, technical services, etc. Trade in services has grown over 30% in the last 6 years or so. And the US, if you look at the last 24 years, it's cumulatively, it's the largest FDI investor in India, sorry. The Trump factor, something that Trump has his eye on very critically, a $37 billion trade surplus that India has with the US. He's called India in December a very big abuser of tariffs. He went on to say, if India charges us 100%, do we charge them nothing for the same? He's talked in praise of Modi, but he continues to be very skeptical about anyone who has a trade surplus with the US. We have the Quad, which is going to be a particularly sensitive area with the Trump factor coming in. Key focus areas have been debt management, regional connectivity infrastructure, critical and emerging technologies, and information sharing on maritime security. But there's a factor here that we need to take into account, especially when it comes to Trump. It's not an Asian NATO, more so because India has been reluctant to enter into a treaty-based security alliance. However, the US, Australia, and Japan already have US-led security alliances. The question really is what the Trump administration may want. Do they want a quid pro quo from India in order to retain some of the trade advantages that India has at the moment? And to keep the kind of agreements it has, particularly the ISET kind of agreements, which are going to be very important for India's economic future, going? Will he call for a more active role to keep China in check in the Indian Ocean? He'd used a term called burden sharing. It was particularly with NATO back in his first term 4 years ago. And there's a strong possibility that burden sharing is going to come back, and he might use that as a negotiation ploy with India. But again, all this is the future. Looking at the China-India context, the border areas dispute is completely intractable so far. The October 2024 disengagement, nice bit of publicity in the media, but then there were differences that clearly emerged in the way each spoke in their handouts, readouts after this engagement. Tanvi Madan pointed this out in Brookings' report that she did just after that. As she pointed out, India's emphasis, border before broader prioritization. China, specific disagreement should not derail the relationship. China suggested a return to economic cooperation, but India was more non-committal. It said specifically it's open to exploring an economic cooperation relationship. Interestingly, last Feb, there was quite a bit of an issue when the economic survey raised the question of more deeper economic ties and investments from China. But that remains open going forward, especially as we come to the next few slides in the presentation, and we look at how India's industry has some structural weaknesses that are going to be significant leverage for anyone who's looking at an alliance with India. India has stated, one of the areas that Tanvi Madan pointed out is India stated contribute to a multipolar Asia and a multipolar world. But China only mentioned the desire for a multipolar world. It did not speak about a multipolar Asia in its readouts back in October 2024. Now, that's very significant, and India views that very significantly because it realizes that China would not countenance a multipolar Asia where India and China are equidistant or equal powers. For India, the concerns and disputes over CPEC remain alongside China's alignments in India's immediate neighborhood. There are long-term questions that India has often raised over China's intentions over the strategically located port of Gwadar and the military equipment sales that China has made to Pakistan. Interestingly, in December, just 10 days after Ajit Doval and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met in Beijing, China announced 2 new counties in the Ladakh region, which the part of Ladakh that is under their control, Heian County and Hekang County. And India's MBA launched a solemn protest. So the underlying tensions, the underlying issues are still not resolved. India continues to see China as a revanchist power. The trade context with China is far more complicated than the US. We will look at some very specific sectors here, trade sectors, which are significant from an industrial strength point of view. We'll just look at a few of them. There's many, many more if one needs to. So let's look at April-October trade. India's trade goods deficit with China grew 58 billion from just over 51 billion when compared to the same period in April-October 2023. FY 2023, imports from China were 15% of India's imports. Exports to China were over 16 billion, 16.65 billion. And mind you, if you look at the last 5 or 6 years, exports from India have stagnated worryingly around the 16 billion mark. they haven't moved very much, not since 2019. These figures hide very significant vulnerabilities. As GTRI, the Global Trade Research Institute, has pointed out in its data in a report that came out a few months ago, India's industrial imports from China are 30% of its industrial product import, nearly a third. Over the last 15 years, imports from China have grown 2.3 times faster than India's total imports. Over the last 5 years, the cumulative trade deficit exceeds 387 billion. Equally worryingly, nearly 99%, 98.5% to be exact, of these imports from China are in major industrial product categories. Now, if one looks at trade theory, it would imply that India has some very serious questions. We need a deeper sector-specific analysis, which I can't attempt here in this presentation. The question that India needs to ask is there an implication that across these products, India's production efficiency is lower than China? It's a very, very serious question to ask. And it speaks increasingly about the asset structure of India's manufacturing and the capabilities that India has in its manufacturing. Let's look at electronics, telecom, and electrical products. China shared 38.4% last year, FY 2023-24. Significantly heavy dependency on China. CII last January 2024 came out with a report which was quite scathing. China accounts for 62% of India's electronic component imports, which poses a significant risk to the long-term sustainability and supply chain needed to build a competitive domestic manufacturing ecosystem. Now, this was quote unquote. It highlighted, quote, manufacturing-related cost disabilities vis-a-vis other competing economies like China, Vietnam, Mexico, lack of big domestic manufacturing corporations, lack of a domestic design ecosystem for Indian companies, lack of a raw materials ecosystem, and CII pointed out that all these add to the challenges that disable the domestic manufacturing of components and sub-assemblies in India. Now, electronics is particularly sensitive if we are looking at growing in frontier technology and across for India's future. You look at machinery, China's accounts for nearly 40% of the imports, 39.6%. Chemicals and pharmaceuticals, over 29%. Import value of 54.8 billion. Now, this sector is particularly interesting. It's one of the areas, it's one of the sectors where India actually has a significant export surplus with the US. It's a key export market for India to the US. And what is interesting in this is that at the moment, without doing a deeper analysis, just looking at some of the products that are coming in, it looks like Chinese import embeddedness in India's economy, in India's chemicals and pharmaceuticals export is quite significant, which means that there's a bigger dependency on China than just looking at that 29.2%. Fertilizers highlight how vulnerabilities arise. China's market share is particularly across one fertilizer, diammonium phosphate or DAP, and it's about 20%. Now, last year, in the first half of FY 25, that is April to September last year, India's import of DAP fell by nearly 75% according to CARE. And China had suspended these DAP exports both on grounds of higher domestic demand and because there was a slight tightness in some of the import components or import product chemicals that they had in manufacturing this. What has happened is that farmers in Punjab, Haryana, UP, where wheat crops are important, they've been struggling to get the requisite DAP volumes that they need. Solar sector, where we're looking at major growth, particularly with the increased focus that we're having on renewables. Nearly 4 billion out of 7 billion come from China. What is important here is that key upstream inputs, polysilicon and wafers, are a critical bottleneck. We need access to cutting-edge technology, and it's a capital-intensive industry. Around 80% of India's solar cells and modules are imported from China. Now, again, here the question of how networks and hub and spokes work in global markets today is very, very important to look at. If we were to substitute Chinese imports from countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, these are all the vital connector economies, which in turn have a high import dependence on components from China in the solar sector. This gives China a considerable bargaining power right across the solar industry, especially where India is concerned. Automobile sector, despite the high domestic capabilities that we have developed in the automobile sector, if you look at a 15-year period, value growth of imports from China is up 320%. Growth from the rest of the world is 92.7%. Now, this is essentially in components. It also raises a very important question over the proposed entry of some Chinese EV manufacturers in the Indian market. You look at battery, motors and components in the EV market, each vehicle could have a Chinese import dependence of around 60%. Traditionally, one of the challenges that the EU is having, and we've seen that from the Volkswagen example, is that, and as BYD looks at establishing itself for manufacturing in the European market, Chinese makers are EV makers, or typically across industry, Chinese manufacturers have a very high resistance to local supply chains. They prefer imports from China. Now, for India, this is a very important question, because how will this impact capabilities improvement and the market shares of domestic EV manufacturers in the EV value chain space? How would this impact battery development for India? What are the implications? As we have seen in the earlier part of the presentation, power arising from economic exchange asymmetries is now a tool for statecraft based on national interests. Yes, the Indian government is looking at these questions. We have the PLI and other incentive schemes that are in place. But what the import data indicates is that the country's domestic asset composition is not optimal. The vulnerabilities are significant. There has been talk about India's substituting other markets for China, but the data really doesn't bear this out across several industry critical sectors. If you look at the implications from the India-US context, the trade surplus and the immediate Trump led political context make India ask questions and assess its vulnerability interdependence. However, it must be noted that India's trade surplus, especially in things like pharmaceuticals, is a significant advantage because replacement exit costs in that market for the US might be high when it looks at how its healthcare markets and pharma markets are structured. The question of coercion by the US will involve deeper questions about a balance. The question really comes up is there going to be a bandwagon effect for India when put into the context of states with China, given how Trump might perceive some of these alliances? The Trump factor in the next 4 years are going to be crucial for issues of interdependence across several parameters for India, including the economy, national and military security. Zhang had a very interesting paper about 5 or 6 years ago. I think it was 2018, when he spoke about Beijing's coercive behavior. And he noted that it's a result of careful cost-benefit calculations. He pointed out Beijing coerces wherever there is a need to establish a reputation and the economic cost is low. But the intensity of coercion depends on the expected geopolitical backlash cost. Now, if you look at the India-China context, there's growing evidence that the vulnerability interdependence is a bit higher than what it is with the US based on industry-specific data. The question arises about import dependency in critical sectors across the economic, military, and national security domains. You look at electronics, it's particularly significant because electronics has big implications for what we are looking at doing in terms of Atmanirbharta in the military manufacturing domain. Does the structure of India's manufacturing sector allow for the capacity to substitute domestic manufacturers for Chinese production based on cost and capability factors? That's a big question that India must answer. Again, one of the reasons why, again, this is needs a lot deeper analysis, and one hasn't seen some of that analysis over the last couple of years, is does India offer domestic firms the context of increasing returns to scale, network effects, and manufacturing ecosystem growth? This is a key question when you look at the PLI schemes that the government has been talking about and how the PLI schemes have actually been responded. There's big numbers coming through, but we haven't seen the kind of advantages that might have come up, or we haven't seen industry take as much advantage of some of these PLI schemes as we might have wanted. The critical factor here now in 2025 is China's domestic economy and its control of globally significant value chains, especially in critical minerals, EVs, EV batteries, chemicals, electronics, machinery. The reason is China's growth. You look, China's growth now depends upon the stimulus that it can give its domestic demand. It might continue to look at export growth as an answer, and there is data to support this, as the US economist Brad Setzer has pointed out. Export volumes last year grew much faster than the dollar value of exports. This was over the 11 months of 2024 that Brad Setzer points out. And it implies that China is willing to use price as a tool in the market. Export volumes were up 13% YOY for the first 11 months of 2024. However, import volumes were up only 2%. Net exports contribution to Chinese growth close to 2% of GDP in 11 months last year. The World Bank forecast that China would grow about 4.9%. So that 2% is a very significant figure. Exports account for around 20% of China's GDP. So in the India-China context, we have to look at the factor of China's high dependence on exporting its way to growth, which is going to be critical for its economy. So if one takes Zhang's assessment further, China will need to assess now the expected geoeconomic backlash cost of coercion, both regionally and globally. But given the significant and advantages that it possesses right across several sectors, one can argue that there will be greater coercion that might accrue to its trade partners. So this dynamic, especially given China's economic context today, has very significant implications for high vulnerability interdependence on trade partners like India. As John Mearsheimer again argued, situations which give China significant economic leverage over those trading partners means that if they join an American-led balancing coalition, Beijing can threaten to cut economic ties and undermine its prosperity. This was in an article that he did in the magazine National Interest some years ago. He also argued that bandwagoning, or rather warned that bandwagoning with a more powerful state, in contrast, lessens the bandwagoner's prospects of survival because the more formidable state is free to become even more powerful and thus more dangerous. So India needs to keep a wary eye on bandwagoning with the US. It also needs a carefully balanced strategy with China. Coercion hasn't happened for India yet, but the factors in play don't preclude economic conflict in the near to medium term in the context of economic security vulnerabilities in India and US interests in Asia. These are going to be important questions. Much is going to depend on Trump's willingness to provide the world with the historical public goods that it has. Is the US Navy continuing, will the US Navy continue to operate in the Indian Ocean the way it has in the past? That's a very, very important question to ask. The costs of the US, what are going to be the costs of the US attempts to impose on China what are the costs that the US will attempt to impose on China to ensure its primacy in Asia? And a factor to consider will be China's domestic economy. As Blackwell and Harris point out, today's rising powers are increasingly drawn to economic instruments as their primary means of projecting influence and conducting geopolitical combat in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. That was fairly comprehensive, in its depth and coverage as well, I should say. You have given all of us a lot to chew, and it won't be easy for us to digest it immediately, but definitely a lot of food for thought.
Thank you, Venkat.
Yeah. So, I think I'll just quickly pinpoint some of the things which Vivek has brought out. So, for example, he very nicely brought out how there are so many commonalities in the way US and China pursue this whole quote unquote national power strategy, and both have a fairly comprehensive view of security spanning multiple domains. He also brought out, how economic interdependence is getting weaponized globally, But here, one wonders where Biden's policy of small yards, high fences towards China, is it going to now witness, as far as the US is concerned, once Trump is, takes over formally on Jan 20th, will one witness different variants of these small yards, high fences beyond China in the name of trade wars and tariffs, which Trump already has said that tariff is his favorite word in English dictionary. Um, Vivek also brought out, how this whole business of economic interdependence is deeply intertwined with countries' notions of security. And given all this, India faces very, very tough choices, whether it is with the US or whether it is with China. How India is going to respond to these challenges and what will be the implications in each of these cases? That's what Vivek has, brought out. Now I leave the floor open. You may, those of you who are interested to raise a question, please be brief. It will be better if you are succinct in your question. And, as far as comments are concerned, we may reserve them for a later time. So anyone, please do raise your hand and I'll call out your name. You can come in and raise your question. Yes, please. The floor is open now. Yeah, Ravi sir has raised his hand. So Ravi sir, please come in.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, sir.
An absolutely brilliant presentation, Vivek. Allow me to congratulate you.
Thank you.
It is very rare to have this subject discussed with so much clarity. I think you've taken a lot of pains, and I think you have very largely succeeded in your intent. Now, I have two questions. One is, you talk of vulnerabilities, and primarily from the Indian side, it is the import vulnerability from China. But at the same time, as you pointed out in your presentation, China has a export vulnerability. In quantum terms, because it is the larger economy, it may not be as significant as the import vulnerability. But it is relatively a factor to be looked at. For example, if India imports, and the figure is, I think, about 70% of APIs for its pharma from China. So it's a very high dependence from India's point of view.
Yes.
But one can then argue that the Chinese API sector is equally dependent on India as a buyer. May not be to the extent of 70%, but maybe say 40% or something like that, a fairly large number. So the vulnerability goes both ways. And as one can see with the pushback to the Chinese exports, this is becoming a fairly significant problem for China. So how much can they coerce on this? So this is the first question. The second question is that, you talk of the geo-economic and the security, the two aspects. Now, the economic aspect of risk is fairly easy to quantify. As you said, you can calculate how much imports cost, where are substitutes available, if at all, what is the relative extra price or transport or whatever it is, quality, etc. That's easily done. But when one comes to the security part of it, the information is completely non-transparent, at least to those in industry or interested outsiders like us. They may be available to the security establishment. So, for example, if one says we are importing a whole lot of electronics from China, as you pointed out, if, as the economic survey says, we allow Chinese investment to come into India and get that stuff manufactured here, and gradually over the period you localize more and more, why is that a problem? Now, the answer to that given is security. Security is a problem. Now, where exactly is it a problem? If the component or the stuff is not a problem, why is investment a problem from a security angle? Now, this question has not been answered in specifics. Perhaps it can't be, but then it should be disclosed that, look, it is so. You accept our word for it. We can't tell you why. So, do you have any further information on this aspect? Thank you. Sorry for the long question. 2 questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bhutalingam. Excellent questions. How much can China coerce on pharma? Like you pointed out, for them, their export of APIs to India is also a significant part of their export market share. But there's an issue here. It's the quantum of import from China that we were looking at. And if we have grown 320%, whilst that's grown only 90-something%, while the other imports from other parts of the world have grown 320%, the issue is, have we developed the capabilities that we need, which we inherently could develop, and why have we not developed those capabilities? And does the cost structure today as it exists impact the development of those capabilities domestically? And therefore, if that cost structure is in favor of China, then is that going to be a barrier for us to develop those kind of capabilities internally? And therefore, does industry have the incentive to develop those capabilities? Now, whilst you could argue that globalization is good and there's welfare gains coming from that import because the cost structure is not in favor of India's own manufacturing, the question is, China could leverage that because it has a far bigger economy, it has a far bigger sector than India does. Whether it would want to, or whether it would want to actually impose tariffs, which would impact India's own import cost structure. Export tariffs have been employed by China. So now these are the kind of questions that we need to look at when it comes to questions like pharmaceuticals or even across electronics. One doesn't know exactly, coming to electronics, one doesn't know exactly. I wish I knew the answer to your non-transparency question, which you've raised rightly. There isn't data from the government which is looking at this. But if one talks to the electronics industry and you talk to some of the manufacturers who are looking at military hardware and electronics in the military context, yes, given that there is a significant dependency coming up, and given that it would take time for local capabilities to be developed in that sector, as the CII has pointed out, we simply don't have the asset structure in that in electronics to develop those capabilities ASAP. So if there is a replacement cost issue for Chinese imports, that's a serious question to ask. So I think those are the areas that we need to look at in terms of vulnerability, rather than looking at China's advantage in the vulnerability itself. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes, to an extent, but I won't pursue it further now. Let me not hog the time.
I'd love to discuss this with you offline.
Yeah, we can discuss it offline also later on. Thank you.
Sure. So Priyanka Chug actually has messaged a question, but assuming she is online, Priyanka, would you like to come online and raise your query? Priyanka, you're there? ICS, please unmute Priyanka Chug. Okay, so given that there are some technical issues, so Priyanka is basically, I'm reading out her question. She is saying that she is from the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia. She is saying, with the coming of Trump in US, is there a chance of changing dynamics of strategic triangle of US, China, India, with a special focus on postulation for India? How will this change affect the dynamics of India-US with the idea of containing China in Asian century? So she says she has some microphone issues, so she won't be able to talk. Yeah.
Good question. A lot depends on Trump. A lot depends on how Trump is going to look at US strategy in Asia. A lot depends on how transactional he's going to be in his behavior with allies, with partners. Is it going to be the continuation of Biden's policy, or is it going to be far more transactional? Beyond that, it's a little hard to say at this point in time. One will have to wait for Trump to come in, a couple of months at least to go, for 5 to 6 months to go, before we can actually answer this question concretely. I wish I had a crystal ball.
Okay. Anyone else? We still have some 10 odd minutes. Please feel free to raise your queries if any.
Okay, so if nobody is coming in, shall I, with the permission of the
Yes,
chair?
please. Yes, of course.
Well, there's Wing Commander Nirmal Kumar. Let him.
Yeah. Wing Commander Nirmal Kumar has just raised his hand. Yeah.
Yeah, so let him come in first. I'll come in afterwards.
Yes, Wing Commander Nirmal Kumar, please.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening. Yeah.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are.
Sir, thank you for the valuable lecture, sir. I had a simple question, like as you brought out that China has renamed its two counties in the Xinjiang autonomous region, that is He'an and Hekhang. So the two basic questions that arise. One is, can we consider this Chinese act of renaming of two counties, He'an and Hekhang, in the Ladakh region as part of its cartographic aggression? And can we also see it as an indication of probable intentions of China for annexation of the same in near future or something on those lines, sir?
It's indeed an act of cartographic aggression from India's point of view. That I think is undeniable, because India has registered its protest. And if you look at the wording of the protest, it talks about cartographic aggression. Look at how it's behaved right across the border, where China has behaved right across the border, whether it's in Ladakh or whether it's in Arunachal Pradesh. And the revanchist intentions are there, clearly, in terms of the future. However, whether these revanchist intentions are meant to be translated in a military domain, at the moment it looks improbable, but one never knows how China will look at this in the future.
Thank you, sir.
Right. So, Sriram Natarajan, Sriram sir, would you like to come online and raise your query?
Maybe I'll just also put mine in because mine also generally takes the discussion outside this tight tripolar kind of dynamics. So maybe then he can take up both these elements, because I see that uh, Sriram's question also sort of goes beyond. So what I was thinking, and this is just purely like the kind of, let's say, uh, questions that arise as we look at how the US factor is gradually becoming far more complex, for India to take the kind of support that we've received from the US for granted. There are certain areas where we believe that we will always get the United States on our side. And curiously, that has also affected the way in which we have to deal with China now, because it's no longer as if we and the United States are completely in sync with the nature of the challenge that China faces, because now the American challenge, particularly as far as our developmental modernization, economic, trade, commercial issues, restrictions, actually, all that is now coming into play. And we don't see a very, very friendly soul out there. So, what therefore it means that the Sino Indian dynamics, particularly as we open up to the larger developing world, will also see a bit of a change. In the sense that it's easy now to think of India and China competing for the global South leadership, providing some kind of role model as far as economic development is concerned. So there's the China model, there's the India model. But increasingly, these are the two countries which will be looked at for generating the kind of dynamism in developmental and infrastructure building. So I think the question is now not going to be just about India, China, US. I think we are going to be having to look at India, China, and the developing world. And there I think we have grounds for greater cooperation between China and India rather than the other way around. So this is just a kind of a thought on this issue, and maybe you can bring in Sriram's point as well if he can.
Yeah.
If he
So
would like to ask,
yeah. Just to save time, I'll just read out Sriram's question. So Sriram says, given a global economic slowdown, particularly the G7, do the options for growth not lie in the domestic economy and expand trade with non-G7 or BRICS? Yes, Vivek, over to you.
Yeah, to answer Sriram's question, yes, of course, they lie with BRICS, they lie with the non-G7 markets, and they lie indeed with the G7 markets as well. We need the G7 markets for trade, particularly because we need quite a bit of access to some of the technologies that the G7 have. So that's the global economic slowdown is a factor to be considered. But then the global economic slowdown is both a question of how much we can boost our exports in a slowing global economy vis-a-vis China, and where the overlaps are for India with not just China, but also countries like Vietnam or some of the Southeast Asian economies, or some of the other economies. And those overlaps are really significant to look at. Where do we have our competitive advantage? So it's, yes, we can expand trade, but we need to look at a host of factors that we spoke there. Coming to Alka's comment, yes, indeed, it is a question of India, China, and the developing world. Within this, however, the question like we raised and like Mearsheimer's raised years and over a decade ago, almost a decade and a half ago, is, will China countenance another rival power that has significant capability in Asia? Will they countenance a rival power in, say, Africa, with significant capabilities to match its own Chinese capabilities. Now, these questions are quite open today, and looking at how traditionally hegemonic powers or hegemony-seeking powers have behaved, it's a very difficult question to answer. So it's a question where India needs to develop a certain amount of capabilities. It needs to look at the developing world, the so-called developing world, for its markets, but at the same time, it needs to be cautious about how it deals with China in these markets. So, because there is going to be a certain amount of rivalry there. We have seen some examples of that even in Africa. We've seen some examples of that when we're selling BrahMos to some of the Southeast Asian, the missile to some of the Southeast Asian countries. There are statements that the Chinese government has put out immediately on the sale of BrahMos to some of the Southeast Asian countries, Philippines and Indonesia and some of those. So there is a rivalry there that is unmistakable, and that needs to be kept in mind.
Right. Thanks. I think
Yeah.
rivalry is going to be the dominant, lens, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm not too sure, because I think things are changing faster, but that's another debate entirely. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So we have few minutes, 2-3 minutes max, for one last question. And assuming there are none, we would like to conclude today's seminar. Anyone? Okay, none. So shall I pass on to ICS now to take over and conclude today's proceedings?
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. We thank Professor G. Venkatraman and Mr. Vivek Y. Kelkar for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. The video of today's discussion shall be available on ICS YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to upcoming Wednesday seminar scheduled on 15th January 2025. Further information regarding the event can be found on ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.